I was in disbelief when I saw my boss dance with my wife at the company couples party. She laughed, looking into his eyes with that lightness that had once been mine. The skin-tight red dress, her lips painted a deep red, everything about her screamed provocation, but what destroyed me most wasn't the kiss he gave her right there, in front of everyone, it was the fact that she showed no surprise. She didn't even notice my presence, even though I was standing there, just a few feet away, a glass of whiskey crunching in my sweaty hand. When her lips touched his, her eyes remained open and serene, as if it were part of a routine. The naturalness of the gesture screamed louder than the sound of the band in the background. It was in that moment that I realized her love for me no longer existed, and perhaps hadn't existed for much longer than I was willing to admit. That dance showed me that, even within our home, I had been sleeping alone for a long time. I was just the echo of a man who still insisted on remaining where there was no longer room for him. There was no scandal. There was no confrontation. I didn't make a scene, nor did I raise my voice. I simply left. I got in the car, the knot of my tie choking my throat and the taste of abandonment burning my mouth. I got home before her, took a deep breath, removed the ring from my finger, and left a letter on the bed. I wrote a few lines. Direct. Cold. But filled with all the pain she'd never been able to see in my eyes. I was leaving. There was nothing left to save. The betrayal was no longer just a mistake, it was a choice. And I could no longer compete with the brightness she found in other eyes. The next day, she returned to an empty house. She found silence, absence, and my last word. She called. She texted. But I was already gone. And perhaps this was the first time in years that I was truly leaving, not just from the house, but from her. The pain that crushed my chest wasn't just the loss, it was also the knowledge that I had given myself completely to someone who only gave me back halves. She read the letter. She said she cried. That she missed me. But not enough to stop me. Days later, she made her decision. And she went in search of the man who kissed her in front of everyone. He decided to pursue the affair that, in truth, had never ended. Me. I moved on. It hurt. A lot. But time has the cruel ability to heal while forgetting. I found myself free from an invisible prison that I myself insisted on decorating with wilted flowers. I discovered a new freedom. A new peace. But what she didn't expect was that her enchantment with that man would have an expiration date. She gave herself completely to him, and before long, he simply disappeared. Without justification. Without end. As if she had never existed. She was left in the dark. Without explanation, without words. And then the other men came. One after another. All different. None whole. None willing. None who looked at her with the silent admiration I carried in my eyes even when she failed. None who wrote letters. None who noticed when she was silent. None who took her home after a party because she was tired, but still pretended everything was fine. And then, one day, she came to me. She came with tears in her eyes and a plea on her lips, forgiveness. She said she'd been foolish. That she'd traded certainty for uncertainty. That she'd confused fleeting passion with true love. That she'd thrown away a story many people would give their lives to live. I listened to it all. Calmly. Without anger. Time had dried up the source of my pain. I forgave her. Truly. Because holding a grudge is like keeping a flame burning that no longer warms. But then she looked me in the eyes and asked if there was a chance. If I still felt something. And there, in that moment, I realized that yes, I did. But no longer for her. The love she once let slip away now belonged to another. A woman who appeared subtly, without promises, without haste. A woman who didn't make me forget the pain, but taught me to live despite it. Who saw in me the whole man my ex no longer recognized. Who made me laugh with desire, not out of politeness. who looked at me as if I were a choice, not an obligation. I told her this. With the same care you'd use to speak to someone about to fall apart. She just nodded. She lowered her eyes. And smiled, that sad smile of someone who knows they've lost. Of someone who finally understands that love isn't about possession, it's about presence. And that the presence she'd rejected now resided in the embrace of another. Life went on. On different paths. Without hate. Without hurt. Only with the memory that, once upon a time, there was love. But love doesn't always survive when it's disloyal. And when it leaves, it doesn't just take the affection. It takes with it the future that could have been. The travels. The promises. The children who might never come. The house smelling of coffee in the morning. It takes away the forever that once seemed so possible. And that's where the true pain of betrayal lies. It's not the act itself. It's what it silently destroys. It's what can no longer be built. It's what dies before it's even born. It's realizing that, when you look back, who you were with that person no longer exists. And even if they return, remorseful, sincere, willing, what was broken no longer fits together the same way. I still remember the party. The slow music. The glass in my hand. The kiss that was no longer mine. The certainty that blossomed within me that night. The certainty that sometimes what hurts isn't being betrayed, it's realizing you were left trying to save something alone, while the other person was already somewhere else. Maybe even in another life. And the strangest thing is that, on that very night I was destroyed inside, something began to blossom within me. A new outlook. A new strength. And, in the end, it was the love she betrayed that saved me. Because, deep down, only those who have truly loved know the pain of being left, and the beauty of being found again by another love, even purer, even truer. But there's something she never knew, and perhaps, to this day, hasn't discovered. That night, I was also kissed by another woman. But it was a light, discreet, hidden kiss, given by a stranger who found me alone in the garden, unaware of my story. And that kiss, so unexpected and silent, was what kept me from breaking down completely. A kiss that wasn't a betrayal, but a warning. A warning that life, sometimes, still has something better in store for us, even when all seems lost. Now I wonder, what would have happened if, that same night, she had looked for me before kissing him? What if, upon seeing me, she had chosen to run back into my arms instead of giving in to a passing impulse? Would the end have been the same? Perhaps she will carry that answer forever. I, on the other hand, have already left it behind. Because there are pains that don't deserve to be relived, and loves that should never be exchanged. But the most curious thing of all is yet to come, because neither she nor I imagined that that kiss, that impulsive and selfish gesture, would be the beginning of a completely different destiny for each of us, a destiny that would change everything. And that's where the real story begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we neither romanticize nor condone any kind of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but they carry a truth. Betrayal destroys lives, tears feelings apart, and leaves scars that not even time can erase. Our purpose is clear, to show, through fiction, what many only realize too late. Get ready now to hear a story shocking, realistic and deeply emotional. Take a deep breath, because what comes next may shake everything you believe about love, loyalty, and loss. In the beginning, there was something pure between them, a connection unexplainable in words, but felt in the silence of an embrace, in the way they looked at each other over breakfast, even after years of living under the same roof. His name was Daniel, and hers was Laura. They met as young people, in an old bookstore, among stacks of dusty novels and biographies, where their fingers accidentally brushed as they pulled out the same copy of a random book. It wasn't love at first sight, but something between curiosity and restlessness, as if a story had begun that existed before they even knew it. He, reserved, methodical, always attentive to detail. She, light, spontaneous, with a sweet manner that masked a quiet strength. They were opposites perfectly aligned. Daniel worked in administration at a large company, respected by his colleagues, discreet but always efficient, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be noticed. Laura, on the other hand, was involved in events, knew how to interact with people, charmed with her smile, her charisma, and her delicate way of solving the most complex problems with ease. Friends said they balanced each other out, that she was the color in his gray world, and that he was the ground she could walk on safely. And for a time, this was true. Their marriage was born of daily life, small discoveries, simple trips, movies watched cuddled on the couch, and sleepless nights talking about the future. The house where they lived was modest but carefully built. Every corner reflected the story they were writing together, the paintings on the wall chosen at Sunday art fairs, the dining table bought with Daniel's first bonus, Laura's books stacked in the corners, organized by emotion rather than author. They enjoyed growing plants, and the porch was their refuge on Saturday afternoons, where they would sip wine and listen to music as the sun set on the horizon. There was a small garden in the back, with a few flowers that she tended herself, and he, even though he didn't understand flowers, dedicated himself to keeping the lawn always mowed because he knew how much it meant to her. For the first few years, the marriage seemed solid. There was mutual admiration, partnership, and a visible effort on both sides to maintain balance. Daniel was affectionate in his own way, loving to surprise her with notes, coffee in bed on Sundays, and silent hugs after difficult days. Laura reciprocated with care, attention, and that look that said more than any words. And even as their responsibilities increased, even as their days became busier, they found ways to reconnect. As time passed, however, small cracks began to appear. Nothing blatant, nothing scandalous, but subtle signs that something was missing along the way. Conversations no longer lasted as long. Dinners were interrupted by text messages. Laughter became rare. Daniel, absorbed in the challenges of his career, sought stability, believing that material comfort would guarantee peace at home. Laura, for her part, began to feel out of place, as if her achievements were no longer noticed, as if her presence had become invisible. And even without meaning to, she began to withdraw emotionally, filling her time with other connections, with people who admired her, who praised her, who reminded her of who she was outside of her marriage. But still, she came home every night. She slept beside him. She took care of his clothes. She decorated the house with the same delicacy. Daniel didn't notice the distance because he was stuck in a routine. He believed that love stood the test of time, that commitment was enough. And perhaps, deep down, he had settled into the idea that things were fine simply because there were no arguments, because there was respect, because they shared the same roof. He didn't realize that Laura was slowly changing, that her silences became longer, that her hugs became shorter, that her gaze strayed frequently. Between them, intimacy became less about desire and more about habit. The bed, once a stage for laughter and caresses, became a space of shared solitude. And yet, he didn't suspect it. Because for Daniel, love was continuity, physical presence, fulfilling the rituals of life as a couple. Laura, however, yearned for something more, emotion, surprise, intensity. Something that seemed to have been lost amid bills to pay, endless meetings, household chores, and undiscussed silences. And even with all this, there was affection. There was care. There was, perhaps, the remnants of an old love clinging to what still made sense. Daniel continued to believe in her, in their marriage, in the promise made years before. He never imagined there would be room for doubt on her side. For him, Laura was the woman he would choose every day, even in the most difficult times. And even though the signs were clear, he preferred to believe that the absence of conflict meant harmony. He continued with his routine, bought flowers occasionally, cooked on weekends, made plans for the future. She smiled. She thanked him. But there was something in her eyes that was no longer the same. Even so, there were no long absences, no lame excuses. There was still the touch of hands when crossing the street, the kiss on the forehead before bed. But the gestures had become mechanical. Laura no longer asked about his day with the same curiosity, and he no longer listened to her stories with the same attention. Each began to live in a silent bubble, surrounded by obligations, surrounded by memories. The complicity, which had once been the foundation, dissolved into a polite and functional coexistence. The two were together, but increasingly alone. There were, however, moments of tentativeness. Planned trips, romantic dinners, conversations seeking reconnection. But everything felt superficial, as if they were trying to piece together something that had already shattered inside. And while he struggled to maintain his routine, to ensure the world around him remained in order, Laura began to question what remained between them beyond their shared history. And in those moments, amidst her doubt, she would still be moved by a memory, an unexpected gesture, a song they both listened to in the car. It was as if, for a moment, she wanted to believe there was still time to regain what they were losing. Their mutual friends began to notice the distance. Small comments. Jokes that once provoked laughter now caused silence. And even at social gatherings, the two seemed to be there out of obligation. Laura was beginning to shine more outside the home than inside. Daniel didn't see this as a sign. He simply saw it as a phase, as something normal in a marriage of so many years. He trusted her. Completely. There was never room for distrust in his mind. He believed that if she was unhappy, she would tell him. That if something was wrong, she would come to him. But silence isn't always a lack of words. Sometimes, it's giving up. And Laura was tired. Not of Daniel, but of the version of herself that existed beside him. She missed being seen, being desired, feeling alive. And in her quest for this, she began to open gaps where there had been barriers before. Emotional gaps, ambiguous gestures, exchanged glances with those who knew how to see her differently. And even then, there were still moments when she hesitated. When she thought about going back. When she lay beside him and, for a moment, everything seemed possible again. Daniel remained oblivious to what was happening inside her. Blinded by his own loyalty. By the promises he never failed to keep. And perhaps it was precisely this stability, this predictability, that was driving her away. She didn't want security. She wanted intensity. She wanted to feel her heart race. She wanted something he, in his constancy, no longer knew how to offer. Yet, they remained there. Sharing the same table, the same commitments, the same memories. What Daniel didn't know was that the world around Laura was no longer the same. And everything he knew was about to change. Daniel began to notice a subtle change in Laura at the beginning of autumn. It wasn't an isolated occurrence, nor a blatant gesture, but an accumulation of small details that he, out of habit of observing and loving silently, didn't miss. The way she lingered longer in front of the mirror, the way the perfume she wore on weekends now wore on weekdays as well, the way she quickly put away her phone when she saw him approaching, the smiles that circled before reaching for him. There was no coldness between them, but neither was the warmth of before. It was like a fireplace lit only for light, no longer for warmth. He, still trying to believe that everything was just a cycle, a phase, insisted on small gestures. He made coffee, left short notes stuck to the fridge, sent messages throughout the day asking if she was okay, if she wanted something special for dinner. And she responded. Always kindly. But her words no longer conveyed the soul that had once so enveloped him. Laura was restless. Internally torn between the life she built and the desire for something new that had already crossed her path. It wasn't just a man, a passing attraction, but a presence that was beginning to occupy an important space within her. The one who made her laugh carefree, who praised her work, who looked at her with admiration rather than the usual familiarity. He was her boss, a confident, well-positioned man, seductive without exaggeration, who knew exactly what to say and when to say it. He approached her slowly, respecting her silences, reading her emptiness, realizing there was so much there to be touched, and that Daniel, trapped in the predictability of marriage, could no longer reach. Their relationship began with informal conversations, coffee breaks that lasted longer than usual, and untimely texts about everything but work. Laura was hesitant at first. There was guilt. There was fear. But there was also a desire that grew and took shape. Her boss was attentive, intelligent, and made her feel alive, important, desired. The feeling of being seen as a woman again, not just a wife or partner with bills and responsibilities, became addictive. He touched her with his eyes, and she let himself be touched. She began to embellish her responses to Daniel, omit delays, and justify meetings that never happened. There was no rush at first, but there was tension in every accidental touch of hands, in every goodbye that lingered a second longer than appropriate. Daniel, at the same time, was trying to reconnect with her. He proposed a trip, suggested resuming old habits, and even handwritten a letter, as he had done when they were dating. But Laura smiled when she received it and thanked her with a kiss on the cheek, like someone thanking someone they no longer know for a gift. He sensed something was off, but refused to believe it could be betrayal. He preferred to think it was fatigue, stress, or perhaps something within himself that needed adjusting. He began to rethink his attitudes, tried changing his routine, giving her more space, and then trying to be more present. But nothing seemed to work. Laura, even physically present, had already left in her mind. The situation took on a new dimension when Daniel's company hosted a large event for employee couples, a get-together he didn't usually attend. But this time, at the insistence of management and because Laura was also involved in the events industry, he decided to attend. He chose a dark suit, she wore a long red dress, and for the first time in months, they were going together to something involving a celebration. The drive to the venue was silent, punctuated only by comments about the traffic, the time, and the next day's obligations. In the parking lot, he tried to take her hand, she hesitated for a second, then gave in lightly. But her touch was cold. Daniel felt it. The room was full, with soft lights, ambient music, couples greeting each other, toasts being served. Laura quickly stepped aside to greet colleagues and finalize last-minute details. Daniel stood in a corner, observing, holding a glass of whiskey, smiling politely at acquaintances. He saw his wife cross the room confidently, moving naturally among the guests, always elegant, always in control. And then, he appeared. Her boss. A tall man with presence, an easy smile, and a look that betrayed undisguised interest. Daniel only knew him by sight. He'd seen him on other occasions, but never really noticed him. That night, something caught his attention. It was the way he approached Laura, the way he touched her arm familiarly, the way he whispered in her ear as she smiled, her eyes shining. Daniel felt his blood run cold for a moment. That look between them wasn't professional, it wasn't friendly. It was intimate. Laura was looking at him with a lightness Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. They were talking too close, his hands were loose, her laughter flowed easily. He tried to convince himself he was exaggerating, that he was just a friendly boss, that Laura was simply comfortable with the environment. But doubt had already set in. He decided not to approach. He wanted to observe, to understand, before reacting. And it was at that moment that the music changed, the room filled with couples on the dance floor, and the boss, with a light gesture, offered Laura his hand. She hesitated for a second, looked around, and then accepted. They began to dance. The music was slow, intimate. Their bodies moved gently, but there was a closeness. His face was too close to hers. Laura didn't seem uncomfortable. Quite the opposite. She smiled, maintained eye contact, their fingers tightly intertwined. Daniel couldn't pretend anymore. This wasn't imagination. It was real. It was something she hadn't done with him in a long time. The worst, however, was yet to come. Because just as the music softened, the boss leaned even closer, gently touched her face, and kissed her. It wasn't a quick or furtive kiss. It was a firm, intimate kiss, the kind you only give to someone you know inside and out. And what hurt Daniel most wasn't the kiss itself, but her reaction. There was no recoil, no surprise, no conflict. Laura kept her eyes open. Her expression was serene, as if that moment had been experienced before. As if there was nothing new there. Daniel felt the world around him disappear. The room blurred, the voices fell silent, time froze. He stood still for a few seconds, as if needing time to accept what he'd just seen. There was no denying it. It wasn't just a suspicion. It was confirmation. And everything fell with a weight he couldn't share with anyone. He left the glass on the table and left silently, without saying goodbye, his heart aching and his chest burning. The walk to the car took an eternity. When he got home, he didn't say a word. He grabbed a pen and paper. He wrote a short letter. He didn't want accusations, he didn't want a scene, he didn't want tears. He just wanted to say he knew. And that was going away. He grabbed some clothes and documents and left. In that moment, a part of him died. But another was beginning to be born. And Laura still had no idea what she had lost. Or what she was about to discover. Time passed like a silent intruder after Daniel's departure. There was no return, no attempt at dialogue. He cut the tie without hesitation. He only left behind the letter, the ring, and an absence that screamed within the house where love once lived. Laura didn't call right away. She waited, perhaps certain he would return after the shock, that things would resolve themselves in a painful conversation, but still with room for reconciliation. However, the days turned into weeks. And he didn't return. No message. No explanation beyond those words she read with a tight chest, sitting on the edge of the bed that now felt huge and empty. There was no drama in those lines, only the firmness of someone tired of enduring alone. Laura felt the impact of his absence, but she didn't cry. At least not at first. She clung to the other man's presence, believing that now she would have the chance to experience something new, something more alive, something more hers. She felt free, certain she had chosen a more exciting path. After all, there was no longer any doubt about what he wanted, or at least that was what he convinced himself to believe. In the early days, the chief was present. He texted, called, and complimented her as before. They went out to dinner in discreet places, enjoying what had previously been forbidden. He said they could now live this life without fear, and Laura, intoxicated by this new beginning, dove in unchecked. They began seeing each other more frequently, and she believed she was entering a new phase of life, more intense, more passionate, without the silences and absences that had hurt her so much in the past. But slowly, the signs began to change. The messages became more spaced out. Connections became superficial. Dinners dwindled, dates began to be cancelled. And when they were together, he no longer looked at her with the same intensity. Laura slowly realized that what had seemed so real might be nothing more than a comfortable illusion for both of them. One afternoon, after days of no contact, she decided to confront him. She showed up unexpectedly at his office. He greeted her kindly, but somewhat hurriedly. He said he was swamped with work, that they had many projects underway, and that this, what they were experiencing, perhaps needed to be rethought. She looked at him, confused, as if she couldn't understand what had happened to everything she'd heard so far. She asked if he regretted it, if there was someone else, if it had all been a fantasy. And he simply took a deep breath and, in a tone that sounded more like closure than explanation, said he had been involved, yes, but that now he no longer had room for it. He said he respected her, admired her, but that he needed to move on in another direction. Laura left without saying a word. And in that silence, inside the car parked in the shade of a tree, the pain exploded. Not because of his loss, but because of the certainty that she had exchanged true love for something that didn't even deserve the name. The following days were filled with hushed anguish. Laura began to mentally replay every detail of her wedding, Daniel's gestures, the small moments she'd overlooked. She began to miss the Sunday morning coffees, the notes left on the refrigerator door, the way he'd listened to her when she talked about work. She even missed the silence between them, now that there was no one to share it with, no empty words. She was overcome by a sadness that didn't scream, but gnawed silently. There wasn't enough guilt to undo what had been done, nor enough hope to believe she could recover what she'd lost. Still, she wrote Daniel a message. She apologized. She said she wanted to see him. That she wanted to talk, listen, explain. He responded the next day with a simple, "We can talk." Their reunion was at a discreet cafe, far from the places they'd frequented together. When she arrived, he was already there, calm, well-dressed, and more relaxed. She sat across from him, her heart racing, but he maintained a calm tone. He said he held no grudges. That he forgave her. That he didn't judge her. And that he understood her choices, even if it had destroyed what was between them. Laura tried to explain, but words failed her. Everything seemed small compared to the pain she knew she'd caused. She said she didn't expect to get back together, that she wasn't seeking pity, but she needed to tell him she loved him. That only now did she realize the depth of what she had with him. And it was at that moment that Daniel uttered the words that sealed their fates irreversibly. He looked into her eyes, with gentle firmness, and said that the love he felt for her was real, intense, and pure, but that he had to rebuild himself after that. He said that for a long time he blamed himself for not being enough, for not seeing the signs, for being too predictable. But that, as he left home that night, he had crossed paths with someone by chance, someone who looked at him kindly, who noticed his pain without knowing why. A woman who saw him alone, devastated, and didn't ask anything, just stayed. Over time, that discreet presence transformed into something greater. A friendship that became something more. A care that became love. Daniel said that he was now with this person, and that she taught him to love without fear of loss. That she valued every gesture, that she listened to him with her heart, that she didn't run away when things got difficult. And then came the revelation Laura never expected to hear. The night she was kissed in public, believing she was starting a new life, Daniel was kissed too. But in a different way. A woman who knew nothing about him approached, and upon seeing him there, alone and lost, simply sat beside him in the garden outside the salon. They exchanged brief words. She said he looked sad. He didn't respond. And before leaving, she kissed him tenderly. A light kiss, without promises, without ulterior motives. And that kiss, for him, was like a calling. Not of passion, but of a new beginning. In that moment, he understood there was life beyond that pain. That he didn't need to cling to what hurt him. And that was why, that very night, he had the strength to leave. Because he had already tasted something new, something possible, a peaceful future. Laura remained silent. Tears fell, but she didn't try to stop them. What hurt most wasn't knowing he'd moved on. It was realizing he'd only been able to do so because someone else saw him at the exact moment she chose to look at someone else. It was understanding that while she was betraying him, someone else was rescuing him from the depths of pain. And now, that love she'd hastily discarded was what another woman held tightly. Daniel looked at her sweetly, touched her hand for a few seconds, and told her she would always be part of his story, but that there was no longer a place for her in the present. He said gratitude still existed, but that love had taken another path. Laura tried to smile, but her face trembled. She said she understood. That she admired him for being able to forgive her. That she rooted for his happiness. But deep down, she knew, she had lost. And not by bad luck, not by circumstance. But by choice. Her choice. A choice she would now carry for the rest of her life. And when they said goodbye on that cloudy afternoon, she watched him walk away with the same calm he'd always done everything in life. And it was then that she realized, with a pain that couldn't be contained in her chest, that she had traded the truest love she'd ever known for a moment of illusion. That she'd abandoned a home for a fire that had gone out before it could even ignite. And that, in the end, it wasn't betrayal that destroyed everything, it was what she'd given up the moment she thought love was guaranteed. But there was one more hidden truth, one final revelation yet to come. Something she didn't yet know, and that would transform the weight of her choice into something even more painful. After the silent coffee where Daniel made it clear he had forgiven, but there was no more love, Laura spent days walking streets she no longer recognized. It was as if the world had lost its colors, as if each step echoed an absence she herself had constructed. The sky seemed heavier, the mornings longer, and the nights endless. She continued her routine at work, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but inside, she felt corroded. It was no longer the mistake that hurt, it was the knowledge that that mistake had forever closed a door that had once been the safest home in her life. Daniel was neither cruel nor vengeful. And this, paradoxically, hurt her even more. Because there was no resentment, no offense, no mockery. There was only an acceptance so mature, so serene, that the impact was even deeper. He had moved on. He had found peace. And with each passing day, Laura found herself plunged into a loneliness that felt like punishment, but was merely a consequence. Autumn was advancing, and the colder weather pushed her even further indoors. She began to frequent different places, perhaps trying to find herself in different atmospheres, trying to distract her mind. One such afternoon, she crossed paths with an old couple of friends who looked at her with a mixture of discomfort and compassion. The husband smiled politely, the wife said few words, and soon they parted. Laura understood then that something had changed not only between her and Daniel, but in the world around them. People who had previously admired them as a couple now regarded her with reservations. It was as if she had been erased from the beautiful narrative everyone wanted to keep alive. The judgments came not with words, but with silences, with missed invitations, with unanswered messages. And perhaps it was deserved. She wasn't looking for excuses. She was simply trying, unsuccessfully, to live with her own choice. A few weeks later, while walking through a book fair used to fill empty Sundays, she felt a familiar presence. She looked around and saw, a few feet away, Daniel and a woman beside him. They walked casually, laughing at something they had just discussed. The woman had a light, discreet manner, and her face lit up when she looked at him. Laura didn't approach. She remained there, hidden among the stalls, watching from afar. There was nothing exaggerated about the two of them, no showy gestures, but there was intimacy. A kind of silent care that hurt more than any public display. When he picked up a book and read a passage quietly to his new companion, Laura recognized the gesture, it was something he had done with her in the early years. And seeing that affection now shared with another, so naturally, was like reliving a memory that no longer belonged to her. And it was in that moment, in that sad recess between the stalls, that she understood clearly what she had lost. He wasn't just a man. He was the only place in the world where she had been loved without reservation. That night, she wrote a letter. Not to deliver it, but to try to empty her heart. She described everything she felt, the shame, the longing, the remorse. She remembered the nights he cared for her when she was sick, the hugs that shielded her from fear, the whispered advice before important decisions. She reread old messages, listened to saved audio recordings, searched through photo albums, searching for fragments of something that could be revived. But what she found was only memory. And memories, no matter how painful, never become reality again. With tears in her eyes and trembling fingers, Laura tore the letter into pieces and threw them in the trash. It wouldn't change anything. Time couldn't be rewound. And love, once dead, can't be resurrected with words. Days later, she crossed paths with Daniel again. This time, at a market. They were alone. She hesitated, but he greeted her with the same kindness. They exchanged a few polite words, asking if she was okay. And at the end of the conversation, before they went their separate ways, Laura looked into his eyes and asked if he still thought about her. Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was more of a gesture of compassion. He said yes, he did. He thought with affection, with respect, with a longing for something that was true. But this thought didn't come with a desire for its return, but with gratitude for what once was. Laura tried to contain her emotion, but her eyes betrayed it. She said she didn't want to disturb or cause discomfort, but that she needed to hear it. Daniel nodded and said he understood. She then asked, her voice breaking, what was in him now that wasn't there when they were together. And he replied with disarming honesty, nothing new in me. What's changed is that now there's someone who sees what you stopped seeing. After that encounter, Laura broke down. She tried to reinvent herself. She sought out support groups, therapy sessions, new hobbies, but it all still felt forced, as if she were living inside an alternate version of herself. She visited the place where they were married, sat alone on the church steps, looked at old photos, and realized that, no matter how hard she tried to find new joys, there was a void that wouldn't be filled. It wasn't about Daniel's absence. It was about the absence of the love she chose to let die. In a last attempt at rebuilding, she sent him a message, asking to meet him, saying she needed to return something she still had, a book with an old inscription. He accepted. And at the meeting, which took place in a quiet park, she brought the book, but she also brought the words she needed to say. He said he knew he couldn't go back, that he didn't expect a fresh start, but he wanted to apologize more clearly. He said he loved what they'd experienced and that he now understood that the problem was never the routine, but his inability to value the simple. She said the men who came after him treated her as a passenger, as a possibility, but never as a home. She never again felt safe in touch, truth in compliments, or peace in a hug. Daniel listened silently. When she broke up, he simply said he was happy. That his new relationship was simple, peaceful, without games. He said he'd learned to prioritize himself, to recognize the signs, and, above all, that he understood that love also means knowing when not to go back. Laura then asked, in the quietest voice ever, if he was happier now. And he said yes. That pain had shaped him, but new love had rescued him. He said he'd learned that true love isn't the one that makes grandiose promises, but the one that delivers on small gestures every day. And before they said goodbye, he turned and said something she would never forget, "You were the love of my life, but at the wrong time." She stood there, watching him walk away, and felt it was the final goodbye. Not a dramatic goodbye, but the silent end of a story that had ended much longer ago than she'd imagined. In the months that followed, Laura remained alone. Not because suitors didn't appear, but because no one else touched her in the same way. Not physically, but spiritually. No one else had that look of pure admiration, that respect for her frailties, that welcoming silence that Daniel offered. She slowly rebuilt her life, reconnected with her family, started a new social project, found some purpose in the pain she experienced. But there was always a pause in her day, a moment when she remembered him. Not with anger. Nor with hope. But with the sweet pain of someone who knows that, even if she finds other paths, she has already found the one where she truly wanted to live. Daniel moved on with his life. With his new wife, he built a new home. Not perfect, but true. With flaws, with difficult days, but with sincere love. He never let the pain turn him bitter. On the contrary, it transformed his scars into strength. And whenever he thought of Laura, it wasn't with resentment. But rather like someone remembering a beautiful book with a painful but necessary ending. And he moved on, not because he'd forgotten what he'd been through, but because he'd finally understood that love, when it's true, doesn't beg to stay. It needs to be chosen every day. And Laura, in that time when she could still choose, chose another direction. And somewhere between what was and what could have been, the two moved on. Each with their own story. Each with their own truth. And the memory of what they lived, kept where only great loves dwell, in the silence of what will never be again. Laura walked in the mornings with a slowness that came not from physical exhaustion, but from her soul. Her body obeyed, getting up, getting ready, and performing tasks, but inside, she moved as if she no longer knew where she was or where she should go. Life went on, but there was no longer any point in simply filling the days. Daniel's absence was no longer just a lack, it was the constant reminder of a choice that could not be undone. Time, which once seemed like an ally, now weighed on her like a daily reminder of what had been lost. There were no more flashes of euphoria, no fantasies of reconquest. Reality had brutally imposed itself, and with it, the burden of knowing that certain mistakes, even understood, leave no room for return. At work, Laura became more reserved. She maintained her professionalism, but the spark that had made her stand out was no longer there. Her boss, with whom she'd had that brief, destructive fling, began treating her with polite coldness. There was no friction, just a definite distance. Neither of them would touch on the past, but the silence between them said it all. She now understood there had never been any depth to it. It was merely the reflection of an unresolved need, a search for something she'd stopped feeling at home. And that, more than any judgment from others, was what truly hurt her. Knowing she'd hurt the man who loved her most for someone who never even considered her a priority. And now, with Daniel distant, rebuilding his life in a different direction, she was left to face her own image every day and learn to live with the weight of her own conscience. On a cold Saturday, she decided to visit the house where they had lived together. She didn't go inside, just stood across the street and observed the facade, the small garden, the windows where she had so often waited for him to come home from work. It was like visiting a past that still pulsed, but to which she no longer belonged. The house was now inhabited by other stories. Daniel had sold the property and moved on. The woman with whom he was building a new life was discreet, little was known about her, but Laura knew enough. He knew she offered him what she herself had forgotten to offer: listening, presence, appreciation. It wasn't about competition, about superiority. It was simply an essential difference. While Laura sought outside for what was missing within, the new woman had chosen to stay, to water and welcome. It was at that moment, standing there on the curb with the wind biting her face, that Laura was overcome by a thought she couldn't shake. What if he had made the same mistake she had? What if, at some point, he had felt the same emptiness, the same longing to be seen with different eyes, and had left without warning? Would she have forgiven him? Could she have borne to see him loved by another with the same serenity he demonstrated? And then, the moral dilemma she had always avoided facing finally loomed large: how capable are we of loving when our pride is wounded? How much forgiveness is there in us when our ego is in ruins? Daniel, even betrayed, chose not to retaliate, chose not to hurt back. He simply chose to leave. And that choice, silent and definitive, made Laura realize that perhaps he was the last man she would ever know capable of loving without reservations. And she lost him. In the days that followed, she began to reevaluate how she'd always understood love. She realized she'd idealized intensity, grand gestures, and moments of passion. She'd never appreciated constancy, commitment, or the small daily sacrifices. She'd always hoped for more excitement, more momentum, more novelty. But now she understood that true love isn't made of fireworks, but of presence. Of knowing that even when the world falls apart, someone is there. Of knowing that even when you fail, the other person remains. And it was this love she lost by seeking something that lasted little more than a season. One night, while sorting through old boxes, she found a notebook from the beginning of her relationship with Daniel. In it were short stories about ordinary days, words that described the happiness born from simple things: an impromptu dinner, a lazy afternoon on the couch, an argument resolved with a hug. Rereading those pages, Laura found herself confronted with a version of herself that still knew how to love. A version she'd abandoned. She tried to understand when she began demanding so much and giving so little. At what point did love become demands, expectations, judgment? And the more she reread, the more she understood that Daniel didn't leave her because of the betrayal. He left her because he realized he'd been loving alone for too long. The therapy sessions began to make more sense. She stopped trying to recover from what she'd been through and began to seek to understand who she was now. She began dedicating herself to social causes, helping women in situations of emotional abandonment, not as a form of compensation, but as a path to rebuilding. She wanted her pain to serve a purpose. She wanted her story to be not only a warning of what not to do, but also a reminder that sometimes you only understand the value of another when you can no longer reach them. Daniel, for his part, was experiencing a period of emotional stability. He still loved cautiously, still had reservations, scars. But there was something serene in the way he faced the days. He built his new story patiently, respecting his new wife's time, learning to love differently, without the old fears. He no longer sought a love like the one he had, but a love that recognized the same values. He was more mature, more attentive, less willing to tolerate neglect. He now knew that love, to survive, needed to be nourished by presence, not just promises. It was then that life, with its cruel sense of irony, briefly brought them together again. A mutual acquaintance passed away, and they both attended the same wake. Their reunion was restrained, respectful. They spoke for a few minutes. And there, between glances that no longer sought answers, Laura realized something definitive: he was at peace. There were no longer any loose ends between them, no gaps left. This was the closing of a cycle. They said goodbye without exchanging numbers, without promises of friendship, without future contact. Just a sincere gesture of recognition for who they were, and a silent respect for the path each had chosen to follow. On the way home, Laura didn't cry. But she felt a pang that would last forever. She finally understood what it means to lose something that cannot be replaced. And, even more, what it means to be forgiven by someone you know you can never love the same way again. The moral dilemma, the true torment, lay in the knowledge that Daniel, even hurt, offered what few would be capable of: dignity, respect, and silence. And now, no matter how much time passed, that attitude would remain within her as a constant reminder of the difference between those who love and those who merely desire. And so, without great tragedies, without scandals, their story unraveled like a knot that, when untied, reveals how much it was held together by only a thread. A thread she herself cut, unaware that in doing so, she was not freeing anyone, only condemning them both to live with the echoes of a love that couldn't survive the absence of reciprocity. And even if the years bring new faces, new stories, that love, which was once the center of their lives, will live only where things that can never be experienced again live. Months after their reunion at the wake, Laura sat alone by a lake far from the city, a place she used to go to think when words no longer expressed her feelings. The leaves were beginning to yellow on the trees, and the reflections on the water danced lazily with the wind. She held a notebook in her hands, different from the old one where she wrote about the good times with Daniel. Now, it was a different kind of writing. No longer about shared love, but about attempts to understand herself in the face of the losses she had caused herself. She wrote silently, with no intention of publishing or showing it to anyone. Just to keep from going mad with everything that lived inside. She had begun to list the questions she hadn't asked, the gestures she failed to notice, the compliments she kept, and the moments she treated as ordinary when, in fact, they were extraordinary. Every now and then, a stray tear would fall onto the page, and she would leave it there, as part of the record. There was no longer a rush to forget, no hope of resuming. There was only a sincere desire to understand. Understand how you lose a love slowly and without realizing it, until it is no longer there. Across town, Daniel was preparing to travel with his new partner. It would be their first trip abroad. No fancy places, but a destination steeped in history, with landscapes he'd always dreamed of seeing but never had the opportunity to. The woman at his side had this light-heartedness of discovering the world together, without impositions, without the need for control. She knew how to listen, knew how to embrace his silence without feeling rejected, and there was something comforting in the fact that she never tried to compete with the past. She simply built the present. In his suitcase, Daniel packed an old book he used to reread when he needed to reconnect with himself, the same one Laura had once given him, unaware of how much that gesture would mean years later. Now, the book accompanied him not as a reminder of the giver, but as a mark of who he'd become. There was no more bitterness. There was memory. And memories, even when they hurt, become less threatening when life offers us something new and true. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through old papers at home, Laura found a forgotten photograph tucked between the pages of a cookbook. In it, she and Daniel smiled, embraced, still newlyweds, their eyes filled with a seemingly untouchable glow. The image was simple, the two of them standing in front of a window, their faces pressed together, a calm, intimate smile. She stared at it for long minutes. There was no pain in that moment, but rather a serene longing, the kind that doesn't scream, just slowly tightens. He picked up his phone, considered sending a message, perhaps just to share the photo, but hesitated. It was no longer the time. Time had passed, the paths had settled, and she knew that reopening that door would bring more confusion than meaning. A few days later, a mutual friend invited her to an informal dinner. He said Daniel and his new partner would be there, that it would be something small, unpretentious, just a reunion between old friends. Laura hesitated, considered refusing, but then accepted. Not with the hope of reconnecting, but with an honest desire to face the present without running away. Arriving at the venue, she found familiar faces, old voices that brought a nostalgic comfort. When Daniel entered, accompanied by the woman who was now his life partner, Laura felt a chill down her spine. Not from pain, but from memory. They greeted each other naturally, exchanged few words, and continued the evening politely. At one point, Laura was alone on the balcony and Daniel approached, a glass of wine in his hands. He asked if she was okay, and she replied yes, with a genuine smile. He talked about his recent trip, told little stories about the place, and she listened with genuine interest. There was something beautiful about that reunion, two people who were no longer the same, recognizing each other as adults, as survivors of a love that was, but that now only lived in memory. Then Laura calmly said that she admired the way he handled everything. That she learned a lot from observing his silence, the dignity with which he chose to leave, and that she hoped one day she could do the same for someone. Daniel smiled, looked into her eyes, and responded calmly, without any superiority, "We all learn. Sometimes we learn from losing, sometimes from being forgiven. What changes is what we do with it." The phrase resonated within her for days. Not because she expected anything else, but because it was a truth impossible to ignore. She realized then that, although she had caused the separation, she was also rebuilding herself. In her own way, with the tools she had. And that, however long it took, was still a path back to herself. As the weeks passed, the two stopped speaking. But they also stopped avoiding the same places. At events, they would meet, exchange greetings, and sometimes a brief conversation, always respectfully. Laura began dedicating herself to a project that helped women deal with the emotional pain after the end of relationships. She carefully shared her own journey, without revealing details, but showing that life goes on, even when love ends. Daniel, on the other hand, began investing in his creative career, something he had always neglected. His new partner encouraged and supported him, and he felt motivated to explore sides of himself Laura had never known. One of those nights, while reading a text she was writing for the project, Laura found herself smiling. Not because she had forgotten Daniel, nor because she had found a new love. But because, for the first time in a long time, she was at peace with her own story. The scars were still there, but they didn't hurt as much as before. They now served as a warning, a map, a reminder. She knew that the forgiveness she had received was a gift, and that, although she couldn't retrace her steps, she could prevent others from following the same paths. There were no guarantees, no formulas. Only the certainty that honesty and presence are the pillars that support any love that aims to last. That same night, Daniel watched his new partner fall asleep beside him. He felt grateful for having found her, for having been rescued at his most needed moment. He knew he could never be with her as he had been with Laura, neither better nor worse. Just different. And that difference, now, was what reassured him most. The love he experienced was calm, mature, without the euphoria of the beginning, but with the depth of someone who has seen everything fall apart and decided to build slowly. There were still parts of himself that were healing, and he knew he couldn't erase what he had experienced, but he also knew that everything he had learned now served to protect what he still had. While the city slept and the clocks ticked slowly, Laura and Daniel lived different nights, but connected by a common memory. They both knew they would never forget what they shared. But they also knew that memory doesn't have to be a prison. It can be just a part of who you are. An important piece, but not a defining one. Their love didn't end with screams or broken promises. It ended with choices. And now, living with the consequences of those choices, each carried the awareness that love also means knowing how to let go, respecting boundaries, and accepting that not all love survives when left untended. Life didn't offer them a second chance together. But it did offer the possibility of moving forward with dignity. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful way to end a love story. Without fantasies, without forced returns, but with respect for what was. And with courage for what was yet to come. The rain fell gently that September afternoon, and the gray sky seemed to match the melancholy tone that carried the new phase of Laura's life. Sitting on the porch of a modest cottage amid the mountains, where she had rented a space for an indefinite period, she gazed silently at the horizon. Her eyes no longer searched the past, but neither did they fixate on any concrete future. She had finally learned to live in the present, though there were still days when longing weighed more heavily than hope. Her life had become a kind of journey of reparation, not with Daniel, who had already moved on, but with herself. It was there, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and the sounds of nature, that she found some kind of redemption. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for anyone, I wasn't idealizing reunions, I wasn't fantasizing about happy endings. I was simply accepting the harsh peace that comes when the pain no longer has room to grow. Her days there were lonely, but not empty. She got involved with volunteer projects in the region, wrote chronicles that she published anonymously on emotional support blogs, and read letters from wounded women who found some kind of solace in her words. She never used names, never spoke directly about what she experienced with Daniel, but in every line there was a piece of that story. The betrayal, the loss, the regret. They were all there, hidden between the lines, serving as a warning, as a testimony of someone who saw a love die due to emotional neglect. There was no self-pity in her words. There was humility, truth, and a maturity that only came after she touched the darkest depths of her own conscience. Laura had finally understood that forgiveness and return are different things, and that there are pains that only cease when they are faced honestly. Daniel, for his part, had settled in a new city with his partner. He now owned a small publishing house, where he worked with books by independent authors. He had rediscovered the joy of creating, of immersing himself in stories that were no longer just memories of what he had lost. The woman at his side encouraged him with firmness and gentleness, and together they had built a life that, though simple, was solid. There was respect, there was sharing, and, above all, there was a mutual understanding of each other's limits and fragilities. They didn't try to erase the traumas of the past, simply learning to build on them more carefully. Daniel rarely spoke about Laura. Not out of resentment, but because there was nothing more that needed to be said. On some silent nights, when he read a more sensitive passage from a book, he would briefly recall how he had loved so deeply someone who chose not to stay. And then he would return to the living room where his new partner awaited him with tea and tranquility, and he would silently give thanks for having survived. Time passed, and a new cycle began. One day, while reviewing materials for her project, Laura received an unexpected email. It wasn't from Daniel, but from a young woman named Helena, who said she'd met a man named Daniel in a small bookstore and had been enchanted by him ever since. She said he'd recommended a text published by an anonymous author on a blog, and that it had helped her through a process of overcoming grief. Laura read it with emotion in her eyes. She'd never spoken to Daniel about her writing. But he recognized her words. He read them silently. And even without a direct response, she knew, in that moment, that the cycle had closed with the gentleness she never believed she deserved. It was no longer about starting over together. It was about recognizing that, even after so much pain, there was still beauty possible in life's loose ends. Months later, Daniel married his new partner in a low-key ceremony, surrounded by a few friends and family. It was a calm, intimate, and unostentatious day. In his speech during the ceremony, he spoke of rebuilding. He said that loving, after being broken, is an act of courage. He said that forgiving is freeing the other, but moving on is freeing yourself. His eyes filled with tears as he thanked his wife for patiently welcoming him, and he promised to be present, not perfect. Quiet applause concluded the ceremony. And when he looked up at the clear sky, he felt a peace he had never felt before. Love had begun again, and this time, it was deeply rooted. Laura learned of the wedding from the same mutual friend who had hosted the dinner months earlier. Upon learning, she felt a pang in her chest, but she didn't cry. She took out a notebook, wrote a short letter, and put it away without sending it. It simply said, "You deserved this ending. Not for the pain you felt, but for the peace you chose to cultivate even when you had every reason to be cruel. I learned more from you than I was ever able to teach you. Thank you." She folded the sheet, placed it between the pages of a book, and left it there. It was her way of saying goodbye, not to him, but to what she had once carried as a burden. That night, she slept without dreaming. And in the morning, when she opened the window and took a deep breath, she was certain she had been reborn as another woman. The two never spoke again. Not for lack of opportunity, but by conscious choice. They both knew they had already said everything that needed to be said, even in the silences. And over time, the story they lived became just that, a story. Whole, painful, transformative. A story that, despite its bitter chapters, served as a bridge to more conscious lives. The love that united them, once intense and powerful, now rested in their memories like an old photograph kept with care in a box that is not often opened, but that will never be discarded. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments, what did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something like this? Which character touched you the most? Your opinion is very important. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and keep following stories like this. Here, you'll find narratives that not only entertain but also touch the soul and make you reflect on the choices that define the course of our lives. This story reminds us that betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship, it erodes the value someone holds in the other person's heart. It kills respect, trust, admiration, and, with it, it kills love. True love can endure pain, but it never survives where there is disloyalty. May this narrative serve as a reminder that our emotional choices are not fleeting. They build or destroy destinies. And remember, this channel does not support and never romanticizes any kind of betrayal. Our commitment is to emotional truth, to the real pain of wrong choices, and to the beauty of rebuilding when all seems lost. Until the next story.